Disclaimer: this video features an intellectual exercise called forming an argument. When I make my statements and premises, please hear them for what they are. To make it even easier for those of you who may have troublingly low listening comprehension skills, here is what I am not saying. I am not saying Monster Hunter is a better intellectual property than Soulsborne, because rating a game's quality primarily on the basis of their difficulty, regardless of how you define that term, is a useless project, and I'm under the personal belief that you actually end up ruining your own experience and the experience of others if it's a large consideration of yours at all when judging the quality of a game. Again, regardless of your definition of the term difficult. I am not saying Soulsborne games are easy. I am not saying Monster Hunter is particularly difficult. I am merely making an argument and taking it to its ends. This argument is not normative. This is to say, I'm not trying to convince you of what you should think of these games, or how you should go about defining difficulty if you feel like it's something completely different. However, I do think if you want to throw some opinion out there, you should approach them with a comparable amount of thought and scrutiny. Thank you for listening.
A few days ago, I posted these two TikTok videos, and I'm actually going to show you them in full because it's important I give you some sort of context for this longer form video I'm making right now. If you've already seen them, feel free to skip to around right here.
Maybe since you play video games or you play Elden Ring merely because they're difficult and for no other reason but that, if I say something is more difficult, what you're hearing is that it's better. But no, we're not abiding by the same rules, okay? No one's stating that the game is better, and maybe that's what you need to hear to sort of like see the light here. Here's what the light is. Monster Hunter has always, historically, and this is someone who plays Monster Hunter and Souls games. In fact, a lot of people play both, motherfucker. Monster Hunter has always required you to know more about the weapon you're using, know more about the monster that you're fighting, and do both of those first two things for longer periods of time than the Souls games. That alone is making it harder. The argument is that Souls games ask you to know less and perform off of that lesser knowledge for shorter periods of time, making it easier to overcome those challenges than it would be a Monster Hunter challenge. That's it.
My statement of fact in the video was pretty much that Monster Hunter is harder than Souls games, and these little quote things, they are very much here on purpose. And I don't just mean some of the Souls games are easier than some of the Monster Hunter games. No, I mean, if you stack up Monster Hunter games besides Soul games that came out at similar times, just so the comparison is a little bit more fair, let me try to center this a little more. The Monster Hunter games will always present more difficulty. That is my statement of fact here. And the premise I have to back that up is that Monster Hunter has more complex combat, right? There are more complex movesets per weapon, and therefore more learning to do to master any particular weapon type. And it has more complex boss behavior on average, as well as longer engagement times. Those are things I think feed into a level of difficulty. Therefore, Monster Hunter is historically demanding more of their player base to overcome their bosses than, let's say, Dark Souls or Elden Ring is, right? So you're essentially engaging with more complexity for longer periods of time. That's my focal premise, and the reason why I have this as my focal premise is because it roots out sort of the biggest buster to any argument, and that's personal subjective experience, right? Here's my example of how it roots that out. Whether or not you had a harder time with Mesmer than you did Elatrion, to beat Elatrion, you still needed to do more for longer periods of time than you needed to do to beat Mesmer. That's kind of all I have to prove here, if you accept my premise, right, to say that Monster Hunter is a harder game. But let me go over some weaknesses, right? Because I think that there are some major weaknesses. I've enumerated 3 of them. Let's talk about this one right here. It's not necessarily true that complexity means a game is harder. This one, I think, is actually a glaring weakness in my argument, and a commenter left an example of, like, difficult platformers that require huge amounts of precision, right? So even though the controls might be simple, hell, it might be as simple as just jumping, right? Sometimes precision, and maybe even oftentimes precision, can offset or add to difficulty in a way that is relevant, in a way that is notable, right? Let's talk about the second weakness, though. If it's true that Monster Hunter has higher combat complexity, i.e. weapons have more options to learn, it might also follow that there are actually more ways to defend yourself in a boss encounter. So more complexity might equal more options to defend yourself, and more options to defend yourself might make something easier to overcome. Also reasonable. I think that there is the biggest glaring weakness waiting for us in this third option, though, and it's that Souls games have more instances of potential difficulty because there are more things to do than hunt monsters or kill bosses, right? Souls games have level design, they have some level of exploration that increases per entry, they have dungeons, they have all this other that can engage in difficulty, right? So really what I think sometimes it boils down to, and maybe oftentimes, is that the games are just too different, you know what I mean, to reasonably compare, and that's fine. Games are different and they are difficult for different reasons, and I think that that is a beautiful aspect of video games, right? Games are hard for different reasons, games are easy for different reasons, and I think engaging in those things is what makes those things great. So, at the end
I know, that first post was a bit spicy, wasn't it? But it didn't ruffle as many feathers as I thought it would, though that doesn't mean it didn't ruffle some. Make no mistake, I'm not one of those creators that makes videos because he wants to be controversial, and in fact, making this video right now was not something I wanted to do until 2 people in my comments told me I should, and I found a way it could forward where I want my channel to go. Look, this guy even said he'd watch it. Hey buddy, I hope you made it here. This one's for you and you too, and everyone else who's willing to listen. In that second video, I mentioned the general layout of what an argument looks like, and I know that may seem a bit rudimentary and unnecessary to some people, but by the time I finish doing my explanations, you'll realize that most of the people you have discussions with actually have no idea how to have an argument, or even what an argument is. In fact, argumentation is such a learned skill, there's actually an entire field dedicated to it. It's called lawyering. Interestingly enough, I actually have a Juris Doctor myself, and before begrudgingly going to get one, I was in college majoring in philosophy and political science. So to say I've been surrounded by the intricate, obnoxious formalities of high-level argumentation for years now would be an understatement, truly. I say all this to say that I have no intention of pulling the wool over your eyes, confusing you, or giving you some bogus black and white nonsense. Really, it's the opposite, and if you've seen my other content, you probably already know that. I want to be really thorough here, but not exhaustive. More thorough than I could be in 2 TikTok videos anyway. If you notice, in my second TikTok video, I had this really try-hard, nerdy layout for my argument, a statement of fact followed by a premise. Honestly, it wasn't try-hard at all. This is how every single argument works, so if people aren't posing arguments to you like this, they're not giving you an argument at all. They're probably just doing the first part, a statement of fact, and then leaving it at that. Other than that not being an argument at all, the reason why this is just such poor practice is because the people you're talking to likely don't have the ability to read your mind and are guessing at the metrics you're using, what terms mean, and the evidence for your argument because you probably haven't told them. So if you ever hear someone simply say Monster Hunter World is harder than Elden Ring, or even worse, Monster Hunter World is clearly harder than Elden Ring and nothing else after it, just understand that's not an argument, and it's certainly not clear. Alright, let's begin our little argumentative exercise and try to take it to its end, or at least somewhere, starting with my statement of fact. I'll abbreviate it as SOF in the future. Monster Hunter as a franchise is more difficult than Soulsborne as a franchise. Hold on, don't go and open the comment section yet, I swear this is going somewhere. Now let's define a few more of my terms here. When I say Monster Hunter as a franchise, I'm including every game that is made by the mainline team and not spin-offs. The reason I'm excluding spin-offs such as Monster Hunter Frontier and Monster Hunter Online isn't because they would muddy up the argument, but they may muddy up the responses to it. That's something you should take into account when forming your SOF. I don't think adding those games detracts anything from my premises, but it also doesn't add anything to them either, and I'd rather avoid having to argue as sub-premises or implied premises that these spin-offs are similar enough to the mainline games for the purposes of my argument that including them doesn't really mean anything. So I'm just going to exclude them outright because I don't need them there. When I say Soulsborne games as a franchise, I am including Bloodborne and Elden Ring, but excluding Sekiro. The reason why is because I just think Sekiro is standalone insofar as game feel and combat is concerned compared to the other Soulsborne games, and while both the Monster Hunter and Soulsborne franchises have undergone a lot of innovation with how their games feel to play, the premises still get a bit overly burdensome if I include Sekiro. Now, I'll be perfectly honest, the argument I will be proposing still works even if I include Sekiro, but similarly to the exclusion of Frontier and Online, and also I guess Explore, I don't really feel like explaining why including Sekiro doesn't affect my argument if excluding it doesn't affect my outcome. The TLDR is, I'm excluding spin-offs from Monster Hunter as a franchise and Sekiro from Soulsborne as a franchise, because I anticipate people commenting things like, well, if you include Frontier or Online, my answer changes, and well, if you include Sekiro, my answer changes. And the effort required to explain to those people why it doesn't affect my argument isn't worth it to me, because it doesn't affect my argument. Alright, so let's review our SOF now. Monster Hunter as a franchise, excluding the spin-offs, is harder than Soulsborne as a franchise, excluding Sekiro. Okay, now we're getting somewhere. The act of me reworking my SOF as more information is presented is called amending. Get comfortable with this. Another reason why people you stumble across in real life and online are so bad at argumentation is because they think the first thing they say is the thing they have to stick with. But there's no rule saying you can't change your mind. Pro tip, you run the risk of needing to amend in front of your opponent if you don't do a reasonable amount of it before you say it out loud. Take my first TikTok, for example. So your SOF should be the most airtight it can be before you present it to someone else, ideally. I'm not doing that in this video. Instead, I'll be taking you through the process. Alright, now let's talk about my premises and the ones I'll be using for my amended SOF specifically. In my second TikTok video, I actually showed you multiple premises but called it one. That's my bad, so let me clear that up for us today. The first premise is that Monster Hunter as a franchise has more complex combat engagements than Soulsborne games as a franchise. And second, you are engaging with that complexity for longer periods of time in Monster Hunter than you are in Soulsborne. That is to say, boss fights are on average more involved and longer in Monster Hunter games than they are in Soulsborne games. Now I've made an argument, SOF plus supporting premises. The strength and validity of that argument hinges almost entirely on how well my premises support the statement of fact, and maybe more importantly how convinced you are of the premises. At any time I see a weakness that could defeat my premises, I'll have to amend them, and if I can't, then I may just have to scrap them and come up with something new. If I have to change a lot of premises, or very crucial ones, I may have to return to my SOF and change that too, so let's see where this goes. Let's talk about assessing my premises then, based on what they afford my argument and what they detract from it, starting with the affordances or strengths. I think the best strength these premises give me is some level of objectivity depending on how I define some terms I used in them. The pretty much ultimate annihilator of any argument you pose, especially like this, is personal subjective experience. But if I convince you that difficulty means a level of complexity exercised over time, or at least convince you that it's a reasonable way difficulty can be assessed, then how many times you personally died on any particular boss the game threw at you doesn't really matter. What does matter is what you had to do to win. If you had to do more things for longer periods of time to win, let's say you beat Mesmer after 75 tries but beat Elatrion on the first try, my argument would state that Elatrion was still more difficult because odds are per encounter with Elatrion you had to do more things for longer to win. Maybe you're convinced of that, maybe not, but I believe this is the biggest strength of posing my argument this way. Let's talk about weaknesses though, because I think how my argument is now still may have more weaknesses than strengths. Keep in mind here that quantity of weaknesses doesn't matter more so than magnitude. An argument can easily have one strength that outmatches all of its weaknesses, and the goal is for your premises to be strong, not necessarily for them to be numerous, though that can certainly help. The first weakness I've been confronted with is, does complexity actually equate to difficulty? A commenter in the first video mentioned the existence of difficult platformers that may have simple controls, but require huge amounts of precision to succeed. So, even though the game may ask you to only jump, let's say, precision may matter when it comes to assessing difficulty. Duly noted. I don't think I actually need to change my premise in the face of this, because this potential wrench doesn't negate anything I've said more so than add another consideration to it: precision. We'll see if precision comes more into play later when we go over the other potential weaknesses. For now, I can concede that at the very least, complexity isn't the only thing that matters when it comes to assessing difficulty, but that was never my SOF anyway, nor was it any of my premises. Another potential weakness is in the same vein as the first, but instead of making me consider precision as an aspect of difficulty, it makes me confront what the word complexity means. Well, by complexity of combat, I mean that each weapon type has literally larger movesets, and while you might not need to learn the intricacies of all of them and their properties to succeed throughout every single hunt, you would still need to learn more of a moveset than you would any given Soulsborne weapon. Before you ask, yes, this also includes spells and trick weapons, which still only require one button to activate, or maybe two, and most of those controls aren't relevantly sequential insofar as combos are concerned. Back on track, even if it's true Monster Hunter has more complex weapon movesets than Soulsborne games on average, would that mean there are more ways to protect yourself against a threat on average as well? Yeah, probably, but that doesn't matter to my argument because how many options you have will still always play into my favor so long as complexity is a focal premise you're convinced by. So even if more options means more ways to protect yourself, it also means needing to choose from a larger array of those options. In a Soulsborne game, no matter what weapon you're using, the dodge button will do. I'll admit the Demon Souls dodge did feel notably weaker than the next few games in the series, but still. So I'll concede that more options may mean more ways to protect yourself. Even if that means you'll lose less, recall that my argument does not rely on how often you win or lose, even if that sounds silly to you. You know what, let me go on a little relevant tangent about why not taking into account the amount of times failing or how quickly or easily you can fail is not as silly as you might think. First, recall what I said before. I'm trying my very damnedest to avoid personal subjective experience as a way anyone can come and take down my argument. On my very first playthrough of Elden Ring, I beat Malekith on the first try. On that same playthrough, when I first met Margit the Fell Omen, I lost him at least 8 times. Does this mean that Margit is categorically more difficult than Malekith? No, it could just mean I was newer at the game. Maybe my equipment wasn't great, or maybe I was just having an off day. You know what, let me give you an even better example. Let's say the first time I tried Malekith, I actually failed 8 times in a row, got mad, then went to bed. The next morning I woke up, ate a good breakfast, and turned on my PS5 only to smoke him on the first try, not changing my equipment or leveling up anything. Did Malekith get easier overnight? No, and odds are I knew his entire moveset after the 4th time I lost him the day prior, so it's probably not that I gained the requisite knowledge on what was required to beat him. I likely already had that. And I also didn't get so much better at the game overnight. Does that make sense? If I rely on failure as a super important premise, then I have to concede that Malekith is categorically easy because I beat him on the first try, or at the very least easier than Margit, without taking into consideration anything else including what I had to do to beat them, which was really lock in harder than I had for any other boss prior for about 4 or so minutes. Second, if how easy it is to fail is a larger consideration than most everything else, that means like Flappy Bird is probably the hardest game anyone's ever played, and that's just not a slope I want to slide down. Sorry guys. Alright, okay, back to the weaknesses of my argument and what I consider to be the very biggest one. If you're really astute, you'd have noticed that my SOF states that Monster Hunter games are harder than Soulsborne games, but all of my premises are about the monster hunts in comparison to the boss fights. That's actually a huge problem because while monster hunts and boss fights may be interchangeable terms, and for the sake of the argument let's just accept that they are, Soulsborne games have a lot more than just boss fights. Some of them have dungeons, all of them have rather conventional level design as opposed to locales. There's exploration, all of which Monster Hunter really doesn't feature, at least not to that degree. This means that my argument is at least misleading if not outwardly false because it forcibly shrinks Soulsborne games down to a single aspect of them, forces you to accept that shrinkage, and then compares the Monster Hunter IP to that shrunken version of the Soulsborne franchise by that overly general SOF. See, I told you, getting your SOF tight and right is really important. That's okay though, in fact, I really like where my premises are as discussed before, so I'm not going to amend them. Instead, I'm going to amend my SOF. This right here is where my TikTok ended, when I cheekily told you all that my ultimate conclusion is that the games are too different to reasonably compare. And while I still feel like a lot of that is true, it's still not my ultimate conclusion, just one I could reach if I didn't want to reconfigure my amended SOF. This is YouTube, not TikTok, and now you're all starting your journeys to become pro-game philosophers and pontificators, so of course we won't end it there. Here's my now twice amended SOF. The large monster hunts in Monster Hunter are harder than the boss fights in Soulsborne. Okay, great, nice and specific, but where do we go from here? Well, we go right back to throwing more things at it to see if it stands against them, because I still have some compelling loose ends to tie up. One recurring and very interesting comment I read on that second TikTok video was a much more in-depth view of the difficulties presented in both games. I'll synthesize those comments in one statement right here. I wouldn't really compare the games, but if I did, I'd say that Souls games have a higher barrier to entry than Monster Hunter, but a considerably lower skill ceiling. I wouldn't say Soulsborne is easier because of this though. Now, I find this statement to be really fantastic in part because I tend to agree, but also because it forces me to incorporate skill ceilings and skill floors into my argument, and I think that's very much worth doing. First, since the people who left similar comments really weren't trying to negate my argument, I'm going to reframe this so it's a little bit closer to a counterpoint. That way I can prop my own argument against it. Something like, I don't know, this. Your framing of difficulty does not account for games that become more difficult than other games over time. Some games can be harder to start, but plateau in difficulty earlier than other games, which may start easier but have a higher peak of difficulty. This is the best I could do after some drafting, but I think it's decent enough. I think how this falls really depends on what makes a higher skill ceiling. If I had to guess, it would be higher levels of skill expression. Okay, let's run with that. My argument would incorporate this potential counterpoint by claiming that games that have a higher level of skill expression are categorically more complex, because mastering more complex things expresses more skill than mastering simple things, especially if those things are even remotely similar, like timings and reactions in a real-time combat role-playing game. Further, even if I conceded that you don't need to partake in the peak of Monster Hunter's combat complexity upon starting the game, the same could be said about Soulsborne combat complexity as well. But let's say it couldn't. That would also mean that you have access to the height of Soulsborne combat complexity as soon as you start the game, no matter your skill level or what you know. So as long as Monster Hunter's combat complexity is on average higher than Soulsborne combat complexity, my premises and argument would still stand. I mean, sure, you can say a lot about how similar the games actually are and whether or not they should ever be compared, but you kinda have to accept that they can be compared in some manner if you've made it this far in the video. Now, just so we don't leave any stones we've introduced unturned, I want to return to the counterpoint about precision and whether or not that plays some sort of role within my argument. Spoiler alert, it actually does, so let's talk about it. First, just because this makes things a bit easier to follow, at least for me, let's make it a formal counterpoint. Your framing of difficulty does not account for precision. In essence, just because one game asks for you to do more things doesn't mean those things are hard to do, especially if those things don't require you to be precise. I think that this is a really good point and something I really have to consider, but I do think my argument has a response to this. Gotta say, I'm feeling pretty confident about it. First, since I'm trying my best to reject things that could let too much personal subjective experience in, we have to find a way to quantify precision. Thankfully, that's really easy in the case of video games since they're all measured in frames per second. So, when I'm talking about precision in combat, I want to hone in on the defensive aspect because that's where the most punishment comes in. When people talk about how hard a game is, more times than not, they're talking about getting smacked around all the time, and the way to avoid that is playing defense. There are a few ways to play defense in Soulsborne games: parrying, dodging, and blocking, and all of them require varying degrees of precision to perform. Same thing in Monster Hunter as well, with dodging, blocking, countering, and parrying. For blocking, all that's required in both games is that you hold the block button and have enough stamina, so you don't have to be terribly precise for that, though Monster Hunter and its later iterations introduced guard points for some weapons that put you in a guarding stance after and during some offensive inputs for a certain amount of frames. Soulsborne, to my knowledge, doesn't have this feature in any of their guarding weapons. So where Soulsborne and Monster Hunter match up, it's pretty much a tie, with the added feature that later Monster Hunter games actually reward you for more precise forms of blocking in a way that later versions of Soulsborne games didn't. Next, Monster Hunter's countering and parrying, which I'm going to stack up next to Soulsborne's parrying. Reason being, I think they serve similar functions. Time and action with an enemy's attack and be rewarded for it with some form of damage. Not all weapons in Monster Hunter games have counters, while in just about every Soulsborne game I've played, there's at least one item that allows you to parry. So, similar to blocking, let's try to pair them up where they intersect. Longsword is one of the 14 weapon types in Monster Hunter and received 2 new counters in Monster Hunter World. One of them is called Foresight Slash, and the other is called Perfect Yai Slash, performed from Special Sheath. Now, while these 2 parries or counter-style attacks in Monster Hunter only came in the release of Monster Hunter World, which dropped in 2018, for the sake of thoroughness and honestly because frame data is kinda cool to me, let's start with this not very great comparison. I tried to find the parry window for Demon Souls, but it seems like the jury's still out on that frame data, and I'm not gonna measure it myself, so I went with Dark Souls 1, where the parry window seems to be 6 frames measured at 30 frames per second, so 12 frames measured at 60 FPS. Foresight Slash has a staggering 45 frames of invincibility, but only 33 of those frames register for the counter detection, while the Perfect Yai Slash has a counter window of around 5 or so frames measured at 60 FPS. This is to say that the Dark Souls 1 parry is considerably more precise than World Longsword's Foresight Slash, but less precise than World Longsword's Perfect Yai Slash. Don't worry, I'm not going to fish through all the moves in the game and compare frame data, I just wanted you to see how the comparison would work. For the sake of brevity, let's just move on to where the games primarily overlap in defense, the humble roll dodge. You heard me mention before that no matter what weapon you're using in Soulsborne, a dodge will do, but that's not necessarily the same in Monster Hunter, so yet another one of those instances where we are just making the best comparison we can. Regardless, to try and strengthen the comparison as much as we can, we'll try to line up the dodges because that's one thing that's been consistent release after release in every last one of the games in both franchises. What's nice about this comparison now is the fact that both Soulsborne and Monster Hunter are long-standing and effortful franchises, so we have a good amount of data to go off of. Not only that, we can see how the games have changed in these intricate but still expressive ways just by looking at these dodges. Dark Souls released in 2009 and Monster Hunter 1 dropped in 2004. While they featured virtually no similarities other than the humble roll dodge and beating the odds, they would introduce to a lot of players some insane challenges and up the ante over the ensuing years. The Demon Soul roll dodge notably had 3 different versions depending on the weight of your equipment, while Monster Hunter 1 had armor skills but not evade window, which increases the iframes of your dodge. For this section, I'll be showing you a comparison featuring the roll dodge data. The lower the number, the more precise the game is asking you to be, at least insofar as roll dodging is concerned, because you have a shorter window to perform the action and therefore you need to be more precise. I hope that's agreeable. I will be comparing adjacent games, so unlike the countering and parrying example, I won't be comparing Dark Souls 1 to Monster Hunter World. I just had to because in that case, Monster Hunter didn't get much similar to a parry until later in the franchise. So it'll be Demon Souls against Monster Hunter 1, Dark Souls 1 against Monster Hunter DOS, Dark Souls 2 against Monster Hunter Tri, Dark Souls 3 against Monster Hunter 4, Bloodborne against Monster Hunter World, and Elden Ring against Monster Hunter Rise. Nice, that works out. I have some more important distinctions to cover before I give you the precision scoreboard though. Oh, hold on. Before you think it's convenient I left out Wilds, this just so happens to be how the matching of games worked out side by side in chronological order, but also they may be more appropriate comparisons because all of these games have all of their content and Wilds doesn't. Most importantly, even if I did include Wilds, nothing would change because, well, you'll see. Back to business about these distinctions. In the case of Monster Hunter, there are a fair amount more games than this, while Dark Souls features weight and encumberment management mechanics that Monster Hunter simply doesn't, which can change the roll dodge frame data. To make up for this, the scoreboard will feature the frames at their lowest and at their highest per game. Also, if roll dodge frame data changed within generations in Monster Hunter, which may have happened, I haven't looked at the data yet, that'll also be featured. I don't think it'll matter for the sake of my own argument which data point I work with when it comes to the changes here, but if it's important for whatever argument you have or have come up with since, they'll be there. Without further ado, here's the scoreboard.
For Demon Souls at 30 FPS, it has 11 iframes for the roll dodge, which is the average and the highest. For Monster Hunter 1 at 30 FPS, it has 6 iframes. This is to say that the Monster Hunter 1 roll dodge is more precise than the Demon Souls roll dodge. For Monster Hunter DOS, 30 FPS, 6 iframes with no evade skill, and 12 iframes with evade plus 2. Whereas Dark Souls 1 at 30 FPS has 13 iframes with light equip load, 15 iframes with the ninja flip, and 11 iframes with the average roll or medium equip load. Dark Souls 2 at 30 FPS is 6 to 8 iframes on average, but it's class dependent, and 13 iframes at the highest. Monster Hunter Tri at 30 FPS has 6 iframes with no evade skill and 12 iframes with evade plus 2, with no change in the other 3rd gen titles. For Dark Souls 3 at 30 FPS, it has 13 iframes, which is the average roll, and 16 iframes with Karthus Blood Ring. Keep in mind that Karthus Blood Ring increases the damage you take from enemies. For Monster Hunter 4, 30 FPS, 6 iframes with no evade skill, but 18 iframes with evade plus 3, and no change in the other 4th gen titles. For Bloodborne at 30 FPS, you get a flat 11 iframes no matter if you roll or quickstep. Monster Hunter Road at 30 FPS is 7 iframes on average, so a slight bump than usual, with 12 iframes if you have evade window 5. For Elden Ring, it's 13 iframes for your average roll, but 16 iframes with Crucible Feather Talisman or Windy Crystal Tear. These do not stack. With Monster Hunter Rise at 60 FPS, you get a staggeringly low 4 iframes for your average roll, but 17 iframes with full evade window.
Now, what can we glean from this? I guess that where they intersect, which is just these roll dodges in some sense, sometimes the games ask you to be more or less precise with specifically your roll dodge depending on what you're wearing. Now that's not to say that counterpoint was a bad counterpoint just because this specific example yielded lackluster results. I'm perfectly comfortable conceding that the amount of precision required to avoid punishment is a valid consideration insofar as assessing difficulty is concerned. Further, I'm even comfortable saying that precision in some circumstances could be so important that it may make a more complex game less difficult than a game that's less complex, at least if you define difficulty the way I did for the purposes of this argument. But even if that's the case, precision requirements for the games don't lean far enough in Soulsborne favor for me to consider tipping the scales in this specific context, even if generally I can imagine that being a very important consideration in other contexts. Damn. I realized I kept on reusing the turn of phrase where they intersect or other similar terms, to the point where I'm honestly considering amending my SOF again. Okay, here goes my entire argument. Where they intersect, namely large-scale enemy battles and roll dodging, I guess. Monster Hunter as a franchise is more difficult than Soulsborne games. My premises to back this statement up are that Monster Hunter requires you to engage in more complex combat against its boss-type enemies and do so for longer periods of time than Soulsborne games on average. While precision may be a factor that could offset complexity, which is what my primary mechanism is for gauging difficulty, Dark Souls doesn't seem to require more precision than Monster Hunter, at least where their defensive options intersect. Furthermore, while difficulty floors and ceilings are also a valid consideration, complexity over engagement time as the primary difficulty metric means that even if the barrier of entry to Monster Hunter doesn't force you to engage with all the complexity right away, the fact that you need to engage with it at all and likely still need to engage with at least as much combat complexity as you would at the beginning of Soulsborne games means that the argument still likely stands in the face of that. The reason why Monster Hunter may have higher skill expression is arguably due to its combat complexity over Soulsborne games anyway, supporting my claim. Also, in order to be convinced by any of this argument at all, you have to accept my overarching rule here that difficulty can be measured by degree of complexity exercised over longer periods of time. There's a pretty high chance you don't agree with that, but at least you can see why I made it this way. In fact, the reason you don't like that may be because you believe that personal subjective experience is the only reasonable way to gauge whether or not something is difficult, because not everything is difficult for everyone. To that I say, yeah, I totally agree. Alright, let's take a total overview of how this exercise went and what the point in all of it is. My statement of fact changed drastically and softened over time, in part because I learned new information as I was presenting the argument and therefore had to reconsider some things, but also because I was able to conceptualize weaknesses in my own argument as I was parsing through it. Whether or not you buy my argument just depends on how you view difficulty, and due to how low stakes the argument is, it felt like a great one to start off my new series. And yes, this argument is low stakes, not because they're just video games either, but because whether or not anything is more difficult for someone than someone else shouldn't have any bearing on how difficult you found it. More importantly, even if you can claim one game is objectively harder or easier than another game in some other IP, It shouldn't have any bearing on how much you or anyone respects or enjoys that game, unless you equate difficulty to quality, which is your SOF to figure out, not mine. The point of this was to create an environment where we were all challenged to suspend what we believe difficulty means in order to entertain what someone else thought, and then view that argument as it evolved over the course of however many changes. I imagine if we brought up more counterpoints, we'd need to change and soften infinitely until we had an even more unrecognizable SOF from the original than what we have now, and I'm totally fine with that. What's important is that now hopefully you can partake in arguments that are more serious and have higher stakes, because my second series titled Playosophy will ask you to do that. Playosophy is meant to be a podcast-style show where I bring on people I like and trust and give them an argument they may or may not agree with that will have something to do with video games. And yeah, sometimes it will be very serious and even sometimes unintentionally upsetting. We will then discuss the validity of that argument and whether or not it has merit, and further, whether or not it's agreeable, or what we need to change in order for it to become that way. I'll then synthesize how the conversation went into a digestible YouTube video like this one, so if you didn't tune into the conversation, you'll at least have what conclusions we drew from it and how we got there. I just feel like talking about things with people can be really enjoyable even when you're disagreeing, but so few people know how to actually do this. I thought I'd use my strengths and the strengths of my community to show one another that we can have enjoyable conversations about things in the pursuit of learning more about them. So one part of the series will be the podcast, and another part of the series will be the YouTube video. I'll let you guys know updates on new episodes as they're being produced. Since I'm new to not only content creation, but very new to the podcast scene, please be patient with me. While you're here with me, I want to give you a range of topics we may cover because it's certainly a range. It was better when it was niche, why we gatekeep. Is artificial difficulty a real thing? The case of Hollow Knight Silksong's difficulty spike. Developers aren't lazy, you're just jaded. Inspiration versus imitation. What is a Souls-like game? And psychotherapy in the dark and depraved. Does No Mercy have societal value? That last one's definitely going to be a doozy, and is likely going to have to come with a few disclaimers and even trigger warnings. But if we're going to have conversations, why avoid the uncomfortable ones? Well, that's all I've got for you today. If you've made it to the end, thank you so much for listening to me yap about something so inconsequential. I hope you gained half as much from listening to it as I did from writing and recording it. Stay safe and stay thoughtful. Peace.